The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. It was one of those typical mornings in the small-town courthouse where the cases were minor and the stakes felt low. Judge Robert Collins, a man whose reputation for orderliness and adherence to the law was well known, sat behind the bench, flipping through a pile of case files. His stern face, framed by graying hair, remained focused on the task at hand. The court officer called the next case, and a slight murmur ran through the room as Serena Williams entered. Serena, a striking woman in her early 30s, stood with quiet confidence as she approached the bench. She was tall, with a presence that seemed to command attention, but it wasn't the type of attention that came from vanity. It was the kind of attention that only strong, poised individuals seemed to draw. She wore a sharp business suit, the tailored fabric making her look like someone who belonged in a high-stakes negotiation, not just a court of minor violations. Her eyes, calm but focused, swept over the room briefly before landing on the judge. Judge Collins didn't immediately recognize her. To him, she was just another defendant, a woman who had likely broken the law like so many others who entered his courtroom. He glanced at her case file, noting the minor infraction, a parking ticket that had escalated due to an expired registration. In his eyes, it was nothing more than a typical violation in a long list of others. "Miss Williams," Judge Collins began, his voice authoritative but not unkind, "you've been brought here today for failure to renew your vehicle's registration. This is a simple matter of neglect. I trust you understand the consequences of this." Serena nodded calmly, maintaining a respectful silence. She could tell from the judge's tone that he wasn't interested in hearing much of her side. There was a certain finality in the way he spoke, a subtle implication that his mind was already made up. She glanced at the gallery briefly, noticing a few curious eyes following her. There were murmurs, though they weren't about her in particular. She was just one in a sea of other defendants who had appeared before Collins. Still, Serena couldn't help but feel the weight of the room's gaze. "I didn't intend for this to happen." Serena spoke with a steady voice, her words deliberate but calm. "It was an honest mistake. I wasn't aware the renewal notice had been sent, and the timing just happened to coincide with some personal challenges. I assure you, this wasn't a deliberate disregard for the law." Judge Collins raised an eyebrow, but didn't offer a response immediately. His eyes shifted down to his gavel, then back up at Serena. The room was waiting for him to speak, and when he did, his words seemed final, almost dismissive. "I've heard enough. This court does not take kindly to negligence," he said with a firm tone. "The fine is set at $500, and you will pay it in full." Court dismissed. The gavel struck down with a sharp thud, signaling the end of the brief hearing. Serena stood still for a moment, processing what had just transpired. It was a decision she hadn't expected, especially not with the calm and respectful manner in which she had presented herself. But this was the system at work, she reminded herself, and she would play by the rules, at least for now. Serena stood motionless for a brief moment, the weight of Judge Collins' decision settling in her chest. The sharp echo of the gavel still resonated in her ears, and she could feel the eyes of the courtroom shift toward her, some curious, some indifferent. For a brief second, she thought about protesting, about explaining the situation more thoroughly, but she held herself back. The judge had already made up his mind, and she wasn't the type to argue in a place where power was held firmly in someone else's hands. The court officer handed her a slip of paper with instructions on how to pay the fine. Serena glanced down at it briefly, her mind racing. She had been expecting something more reasonable, perhaps a warning or a smaller fine. But this decision felt harsh, especially given how she had tried to be respectful and transparent in her defense. As she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished courthouse floor, she couldn't help but notice the looks she was getting. Some faces appeared sympathetic, while others were filled with indifference. A few of the other defendants, seated in the gallery, glanced at her with subtle expressions of judgment or curiosity, but Serena didn't let it bother her. She had been in tougher situations before, and this, though frustrating, was something she could handle. Once outside, the cool air hit her face, and for the first time that day, she felt a slight sense of relief. But the sting of the fine lingered. As she reached her car, she caught sight of a familiar face in the parking lot. A man in a crisp military uniform. Major Tom Hawkins, a fellow officer she had worked with during various assignments, stood by his vehicle, seemingly waiting for someone. His eyes widened when he spotted her. "Serena," Tom called out, stepping toward her with a surprised smile. "What are you doing here?" Serena smiled back, though the exhaustion in her expression was undeniable. "I just got out of court," she said, trying to keep the mood light. "Apparently, I'm guilty of neglecting my car registration." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you. What happened?" She briefly recounted the situation, explaining how the parking ticket had turned into a larger issue, how she had tried to explain the circumstances, only for the judge to impose the full fine without giving her a chance to present all the details. Tom frowned, sensing something off about the whole situation. "That seems a little extreme for a minor violation," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "Are you okay?" Serena paused for a moment, glancing back at the courthouse behind her. She felt a mix of frustration and resignation. "I'm fine," she replied, though the weight of the fine seemed to press down on her more than she let on. "But I didn't expect it to go this way." "I guess you never really know what to expect when you're standing before a judge." Tom studied her for a moment, something in his eyes flickering with recognition. "You're sure everything's all right?" Serena hesitated, then nodded. "I'll figure it out. I just didn't think a simple mistake would cost me so much." As Tom nodded in understanding, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation than Serena was letting on. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a much bigger story that would soon unfold. Tom watched Serena with a thoughtful expression, clearly sensing that something wasn't adding up. He knew her well enough to recognize when she wasn't being completely upfront, but he also respected her ability to handle pressure. He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Serena, if you need to talk about this more, about the judge, or anything, I'm here." Serena gave him a small, appreciative smile. "Thanks, Tom. I'll be all right. It's just frustrating, you know. I've handled much bigger challenges before, but this one felt off." Tom nodded, considering her words. "I get it. And look, you know, I've been through my share of frustrating moments. But there's something about this situation that doesn't sit right with me. That judge didn't even seem to listen to your explanation. He just jumped straight to the fine." Serena sighed, her eyes narrowing slightly. "That's exactly what bothered me. I felt dismissed from the very start. The judge had his mind made up before I even spoke. And honestly, after being in this business for so long, I know that things don't always work like that. There's a system for a reason." Tom's brow furrowed. He knew Serena worked in the Justice Division, a specialized branch of the Army that dealt with both military and civilian legal matters. It wasn't something she talked about much, but he knew that her role in the military had given her a rare and powerful perspective on how laws were enforced. She had more experience with legal systems than most people realized. Still, he hadn't fully grasped the extent of her authority. "Hold on," Tom said, a thought dawning on him. "Wait a second. You're telling me you're in the Justice Division. You've got the kind of clearance and knowledge that cold." "Tom," Serena interrupted, shaking her head slightly. "I'm not trying to pull rank or anything. I just wanted to get through this day without making waves." She paused for a moment, her tone shifting slightly as she met his eyes. "But yeah, you're right. I've worked cases where the stakes were much higher than a parking ticket. I know the law, and I know when something isn't right." Tom took a step back, his surprise evident. "I had no idea." So the judge, he had no clue who he was dealing with. Serena chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Not at all. And maybe that's part of the problem. He saw a black woman in a suit and assumed I was just like the others who come through here, the ones he deals with on a daily basis. But I'm not. And I don't take kindly to being underestimated. Tom could see the resolve in her eyes now. He knew better than to push any further. Serena had always been someone who fought for what was right, but now it was clear that this wasn't just about a fine. It was about something much bigger. Tom watched her for a moment, processing the weight of her words. "You're going to do something about it, aren't you?" he asked. Serena didn't answer right away. She simply turned her head, glancing back toward the courthouse, her jaw tightening as she silently resolved to take action. "I have to. If this judge isn't going to listen to reason, I'll make sure he has no choice but to." The air between them grew quieter, and Tom could feel the shift in Serena's determination. He knew whatever was about to happen next, it would be a lot bigger than a simple court case. Serena wasn't just going to let this go. Something inside her had already started to move toward a higher purpose. She wasn't just challenging a fine. She was challenging an injustice. And that was something she knew too well how to handle. As Serena and Tom stood outside the courthouse, a feeling of quiet determination settled over her. She had walked away from that court hearing with more than just a fine. She had walked away with a simmering resolve to make things right, not just for herself, but for anyone who might find themselves in the same situation. Tom watched her carefully, sensing the shift in her energy. "Look, I don't know how deep you want to go with this, but you've got connections," he said. "I mean, you're not just any officer. You're part of the Justice Division, right? That's a big deal." Serena nodded, her face softening with a mix of frustration and clarity. "It is a big deal, Tom. And that's the problem. This isn't just about me. It's about the system. I don't think people realize how many cracks exist in it. The law is meant to be impartial, but the reality is, it's influenced by bias, perception, and sometimes just ignorance." She paused, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. "I'm not going to let this slide. If I let this pass, if I accept this decision as final, it sends a message that it's okay to treat people like this, based on assumptions and prejudice. I'm not that person, and I refuse to let anyone else be treated the same way." Tom looked at her, impressed by the quiet strength emanating from her. "So, what now?" Serena took a deep breath, thinking about her next steps. "I'm going to reach out to my superior, Colonel Sarah Mitchell. She's got the kind of influence that can make waves. She's also a legal expert who can help me navigate this." She hesitated. "But it's not just about fixing this fine. It's about making sure that this kind of thing doesn't keep happening to anyone, anywhere." Tom nodded in understanding, but he couldn't help but feel a little surprised by how quickly Serena had shifted into action mode. She wasn't just processing the injustice for herself. She was already thinking on a larger scale. "Well," Tom said with a grin, "if anyone can make the judge realize his mistake, it's you. And if it means getting him to rethink his approach, then I'm all for it." Serena managed to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks, Tom. But this isn't about him anymore. It's about setting a precedent." Later that day, Serena sat in her apartment, drafting an email to Colonel Sarah Mitchell. She detailed the situation at the courthouse, explaining the fine, the judge's demeanor, and her growing concern that the decision had been influenced by biases you couldn't ignore. As she typed, she thought about her position in the Justice Division, the unit tasked with ensuring fairness, both in military and civilian law. She knew Colonel Mitchell would understand the gravity of the situation. After hitting send, Serena sat back, her eyes lingering on the screen. The feeling of not being heard, of being disregarded based on appearance, was something all too familiar. But this time, it would be different. She was determined to make sure of it. Her phone buzzed moments later. An email from Colonel Mitchell. Serena's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The response was swift, and it confirmed what she already knew. She was not alone in this fight. Serena read the email from Colonel Mitchell twice, the words sinking in with a sense of urgency. Colonel Mitchell's response was concise but direct. "We'll address this. This type of behavior cannot go unchecked, especially in a court of law. I'll make the necessary arrangements. Stand by." Serena felt a surge of relief, knowing that the wheels were in motion. Colonel Mitchell was a seasoned officer, a force within the Justice Division, and one of the few people Serena trusted to handle this kind of matter. Mitchell had seen and managed enough high-profile cases to understand the delicate balance between the military's influence and civilian law. If anyone could make the system listen, it was her. Serena closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had expected some form of support from her division, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly Colonel Mitchell would act. It wasn't just about having connections or a rank that commanded attention. It was about the Justice Division's mandate to protect fairness, no matter where the violation occurred. She knew this case, while seemingly minor, could be the first domino in a much larger conversation about the judicial system's blind spots, how judges, particularly in small-town courts, could wield their power without fear of accountability. That had been the problem. Judge Collins had made his ruling based on an assumption, treating her like any other defendant who entered his courtroom, dismissing her explanation without so much as a second thought. But now, Serena wasn't going to let him get away with it. This wasn't just about challenging a fine. This was about challenging a system that allowed unchecked biases to influence decisions. The next day, Colonel Mitchell called Serena. "We're moving forward. I've already spoken with legal counsel. We'll schedule a formal meeting with the judge and have you there to present your case. We'll make sure everything is documented thoroughly." Serena's pulse quickened. "When?" "As soon as possible. I'll need you to come to the office for a briefing this afternoon. We'll go over the specifics before we make any public statements." Serena nodded, already preparing herself mentally for what lay ahead. "Understood. I'll be there." By the time she arrived at the office, the air was thick with anticipation. Colonel Mitchell was waiting for her, along with a team of legal experts who worked alongside the Justice Division. They went over every detail of the court hearing, replaying the judge's exact words, examining the decision, and identifying where things had gone wrong. Serena knew the outcome was going to be more than just about her fine. It was going to be about shining a light on how easily authority could be misused in a system that was supposed to be impartial. "Serena, I'm going to need you to remain calm and composed," Colonel Mitchell said, her voice steady but firm. "We'll approach this with professionalism, but we're not going to let the judge off the hook. He needs to understand the implications of his actions." Serena nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm ready. Let's do this." The wheels were now turning, and Serena felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in a long time. This was no longer just about the fine. It was about the bigger picture, about changing the way things were done. Judge Collins had made a mistake, and now it was time for him to own up to it. And Serena Williams, armed with the full weight of the Justice Division, was going to make sure of it. The following week, Serena stood in front of the courthouse once more, but this time, the air felt different. The weight of the case, the importance of what she was about to do, hung heavily on her shoulders. The courthouse, which had seemed so ordinary just days ago, now felt like a battleground. Serena wasn't just going back to face a judge. She was going back to face an entire system that had, knowingly or unknowingly, allowed bias and assumptions to influence its decisions. Serena wasn't alone this time. Standing beside her was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the head of the Justice Division, whose presence alone commanded attention. Along with them were a handful of legal experts, some of whom worked directly within the military's legal framework, ensuring that fairness was maintained in both civilian and military courts. It wasn't just about Serena's case anymore. This was bigger than that. It was about setting a precedent for how civilians and military personnel should be treated in legal settings, regardless of their appearance or background. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual hum of people coming and going, the casual chatter of defendants waiting for their cases to be heard, was replaced by an electric tension. Whispers spread through the room as people took notice of the group that had entered, their suits sharp, their expressions serious. The sight of Colonel Mitchell alone was enough to catch attention, but the presence of Serena, in her full capacity as an Army officer, sent a ripple through the room. Judge Collins, who had been presiding over the docket with his usual air of authority, glanced up as he noticed Serena and Colonel Mitchell approach the bench. His eyes flickered briefly between them, registering the unexpected shift. His posture tightened, but he didn't immediately speak. Instead, he scanned the room, as if trying to make sense of the situation. Serena stood tall, her expression unreadable, while Colonel Mitchell remained poised next to her. The silence was palpable, broken only by the soft shuffle of papers on the judge's desk. "Your Honor," Serena began, her voice calm but firm. "I am Serena Williams, an officer in the Army's Justice Division. I am here today not just to revisit the fine you imposed on me, but to discuss the broader implications of your ruling and how it reflects on the fairness of this court." Judge Collins blinked, his confusion momentarily surfacing. He had no idea who Serena was, nor did he understand why she had returned with such a commanding presence. His hand hovered over the gavel, but for a moment, he didn't strike it. Instead, he looked at her carefully, trying to assess the situation. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, her authoritative voice cutting through the silence. "Judge Collins, with all due respect, we are here to address not only the fine but also the process that led to its imposition. We believe your ruling was made without a fair consideration of the circumstances and the individual standing before you. The decision needs to be reviewed, and a reassessment must occur." Serena could see the subtle shift in Judge Collins' demeanor. He had not expected this level of confrontation. The room, once filled with casual observers, now felt like a quiet battlefield. Every eye in the room was fixed on the exchange. Serena could feel the weight of the moment, but she stood her ground. This wasn't about personal vindication. It was about fairness. The judge's hand finally dropped, and he gave a slow nod. "I understand," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "We will discuss this further." Serena exchanged a brief, meaningful look with Colonel Mitchell. It was only the beginning, but they had taken the first step in forcing a conversation that was long overdue. The judge's authority, once unquestioned, was now being challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. The fight for fairness had begun. The silence that followed was thick, hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Judge Collins sat there, his gaze flicking between Serena and Colonel Mitchell, the weight of their presence pressing down on him. The room seemed to hold its breath as the judge slowly cleared his throat and looked at the paperwork in front of him, as if searching for a way to regain control of the situation. But the once familiar authority he had wielded with ease now felt less certain, less absolute. Serena's calm demeanor never wavered, though the tension in her chest was hard to ignore. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the wheels of justice had to turn in her favor, not because of her rank, but because of the fairness that the law was supposed to uphold. She wasn't just challenging the fine anymore. She was challenging the very foundation of how justice was being served in this court. "I'm here today, not just as a defendant," Serena said, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that filled the room. "I'm here because this court's actions speak volumes about the assumptions we make about people, about who deserves respect, who deserves a fair hearing. And I'm not here to make excuses, but I'm asking for the same fairness that anyone else in this courtroom would be granted." Judge Collins remained silent, the once confident lines of his face now tense with uncertainty. He glanced over at Colonel Mitchell, whose sharp gaze did not leave him. The judge seemed to understand, in that moment, that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. It was one he was going to have to take seriously. Serena continued, her words measured, carefully chosen. "I've been in situations where my judgment, my actions, have been questioned, not because of anything I've done, but because of who I am. I'm sure you can understand that, Your Honor. But the law doesn't care about those things. It shouldn't. The law is supposed to protect us, all of us, equally." Colonel Mitchell stepped forward, her presence even more commanding than before. "Judge Collins," she said, her voice cutting through the room with military precision, We're not asking for leniency. We're asking for accountability. Your ruling may have seemed like a small matter, but the principle behind it has much larger implications. We cannot allow biases, whether intentional or not, to influence legal decisions. Serena could see the judge's expression soften, his eyes flickering with the beginnings of realization. This wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about understanding that the court had a responsibility to ensure justice for everyone, regardless of their background, their appearance, or their station in life. His eyes drifted briefly to the small gallery of spectators, and Serena could sense the shift in him, the awareness dawning that his actions had consequences beyond just the fine he had imposed. I see your point," Judge Collins muttered, his voice quieter now, less authoritative than before. "Perhaps I did act hastily." Serena nodded, her expression not one of victory, but of quiet resolution. "That's all I'm asking, Your Honor. A reconsideration. Not just for me, but for anyone who walks into this court expecting a fair chance." The room was still, and for the first time, Judge Collins seemed to be considering the gravity of the moment. It was clear that Serena's words had left an impact. It wasn't about her case alone anymore. It was about something larger. Serena and Colonel Mitchell exchanged a look, silently acknowledging the breakthrough. They weren't just fighting for justice in one case. They were making sure that the system itself would be held to account. And that, for Serena, was the first real step toward change. The room was still, the tension palpable as Judge Collins sat and thought. Serena remained calm, her gaze steady, but inside, her heart raced. She had taken the first step in challenging the system, and now she could only wait to see if it would pay off. Judge Collins cleared his throat again, his voice sounding less certain. "I understand the weight of your words, Ms. Williams and Colonel Mitchell. This court is meant to serve all people fairly, and I recognize that my previous decision may not have reflected that principle." There was a moment of silence, and Serena could feel the shift in the air, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had changed, not just in the court, but in the very fabric of how justice was being applied. The room had shifted from a place of quiet authority to one of genuine reflection. Serena's calm determination and Colonel Mitchell's no-nonsense leadership had planted the seeds of introspection. Judge Collins looked at the paperwork again, the case file that had once seemed so trivial, now carrying a weight far beyond a simple parking violation. He adjusted his glasses and looked back up at Serena. "I will reconsider my ruling," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality, but also humility. "Given the circumstances, I will waive the fine and take further steps to ensure a review of the court's processes to avoid any future misunderstandings or biases." Serena's eyes narrowed slightly, not with distrust, but with a quiet resolve. She had expected nothing less than this outcome, but she also knew that one decision wasn't enough. She had pushed for accountability. And now, the hard work would be ensuring that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It would take ongoing vigilance to make sure the system truly changed. Colonel Mitchell spoke next, her voice firm but measured. "Thank you, Your Honor. We appreciate your willingness to reconsider. We hope this will be the first of many steps toward ensuring fairness in every court. It's not just about one case. It's about how we treat every individual who walks through that door." Serena nodded in agreement, her thoughts still racing. This was a victory, but not a final one. Change wasn't instantaneous, and this courtroom was just one small part of a much larger system that needed to be overhauled. As they left the courtroom, Serena felt a wave of mixed emotions. There was relief, but also a deep, unspoken understanding that the journey was far from over. This battle had been won, but the war for justice was ongoing. Outside, Tom Hawkins, who had been waiting for them, gave Serena an approving look. "You did it," he said with a grin. The judge actually listened. Serena smiled faintly. "For now, but we got a long way to go." Colonel Mitchell placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've set the tone, Serena. You've shown that when we stand up for fairness, we can make a real difference. And now we keep moving forward. As Serena walked away from the courthouse, her mind was already on the next challenge. The battle for justice didn't end with one courtroom. But today, she had made a stand, and that was the first step in changing everything.